And we are just delighted to have him join us tonight, so please give the warmest of warm welcomes to Dr. Glenn Sunshine. I'll also say we're going to do some Q&A afterwards. And so that should be fun. But I'll leave it to you, Dr. Glenn.
All right, well, thank you all for having me here. It's a little bit of a surprise to see so many people out in a brew pub in the middle of the week for this. So in any event, thank you all for inviting me here. What I was asked to talk about is the issue of resistance. Now, we're in a situation right now where it's pretty obvious we're facing some real challenges, not only as Christians, but simply as people who believe in liberty. You know, whether it's liberty, you know, our own personal liberty as Christians, but also the world around us is increasingly encroaching on the liberties of everyone. You know, this isn't just simply a Christian issue. But as Christians, we need to learn to think about things through the lens of biblical truth. And what I tried to do in Slaying Leviathan is to show how Christians have approached this issue of resistance on limitations of government power and things like that through the centuries. The problem that we've got today, and I'll try to circle back to this toward the end, is unlike in other periods of history, it's not just the government that we've got to worry about. You know, we have this issue of big tech. You know, we don't need to have the government silencing us because Twitter will do it for them. Facebook will do it for them. You know, social media, it is so ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And it is the principal means of communication for most people. And yet we're seeing it being shut down in the name of a particular political ideology, which also happens to be in place with one of the major parties in the government. Okay? So we're going to need to think about that as well. But let's just start off with the simpler one, the political issue. And the way we really need to begin with this is with Jesus. As Christians, this is always a good place to start, right? The Pharisees came to Jesus with a trap, and they said to him, yeah, hey, can we pay taxes? Is it legal for us as Jews, as God's people, to peel out? Is it legal for us to pay taxes to the Roman government? Now, this was a trap because there's no way he can answer that question. If he says yes, he loses the Jews, you know, the majority of the population. If he says no, the Romans kill him. Okay, so this was a trap. It was a no-win situation. Jesus, of course, outsmarts them, and he does this on several levels. First of all, he says, show me the coin. And they give him a coin. He says, okay, whose picture and image is on it? By the way, whenever you're dealing with Judaism, when you run into words like images, start paying attention. Because what we're referring to here is the second commandment. The implication is, without Jesus even saying this, the implication is something that he said elsewhere. The Pharisees were worshiping money. They were making an idol out of their coins. But beyond that, that's sort of a separate issue. Beyond that, he tells them to give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God what's God's. That is the fundamental principle as we are looking at government that we always need to be thinking about. The question nobody seems to be asking in the Christian world, in the evangelical world, is what belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God. Okay, so the first part of this, give to Caesar what's Caesar's. Jesus is telling them Caesar has legitimate rights. There are legitimate things that Caesar has authority over. He can, in fact, collect taxes. We're told elsewhere, give everyone whatever is his due. Taxes, revenue, honor, give it to whom it's due. Okay, so there is a legitimate place for government authority and for collecting taxes, but you can't do that in such a way that it undermines or replaces God's authority. There are some things that belong to Caesars, but there's a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't. Okay? And let's add one other thing. The person who determines what's Caesar's isn't Caesar, it's God. God is the one who determines what's Caesar's. Okay, so that's the situation we're dealing with here. That's the answer. And from that point on, throughout church history, Christians have been, struggling and wrestling with exactly what the issue of what is Caesar's and what is God's. The fact of the matter is, Christians have always been opposed to totalitarianism. They've always been opposed to the idea of unlimited government power. They've always been opposed to the idea that the government has authority over everything. We see this in a bunch of different ways. The most fundamental confession of the early church was that Caesar is Lord. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean a lot to us today. But in the Roman Empire, the de facto creed of the empire was Caesar is Lord. And when the Christians come along and say, no, Jesus is Lord, that is an inescapably political statement in the context of the Roman Empire. And in fact, Christians were persecuted primarily not because of their, quote, religion, not because of the things we think of as religion, but because they refused to acknowledge the supreme authority of Caesar. Let's jump ahead all the way to the book of Revelation. Let's take a look at something in Revelation that's often discussed, but rarely in context. The mark of the beast. Let's talk about the mark of the beast here for a minute. What is it? Okay, the 666. Some manuscripts say 616, but let's just stick with 666. What's going on there? Well, they tell you, John tells you, it's a number, but it's the number of a man. Now, that cues you in on what's going on. In this period, there were letters. We don't have numbers like we have them today. Letters are used for numbers. And there were various kinds of numerical codes that were set up using the letters. And when you wanted to disguise who you were talking about, you converted the name into numbers, and then you just used the number, and that was a way of sort of disguising what you were doing. 666 corresponds to Nero Caesar. If you transcribe it a different way and do the conversion, it ends up being 616. The early church understood that the mark of the beast had to do with Nero Caesar. So what's going on here? Well, what do they tell you to do? The number has to be placed on your right hand or on your forehead. What in Scripture goes on your right hand or your forehead? The phylacteries, which contain a kind of important verse from Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Bind this on your right hand and on your forehead, and so on. Okay? What that was saying, now the Jews took this literally. They literally would put boxes on their forehead and hands. And actually, you can still find Orthodox Jews who do that. The point, though, was less that you actually physically bind these things on your forehead and your hand, and much more that, well, what does this say? Loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength is right here. It's right. You are looking out at the world under the Great Commandment. You are seeing the world through the lens of the Great Commandment. It's guiding your thinking. It's on your right hand. It's guiding your doing. That's the point of that. So what happens when you replace love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength with Nero Caesar? Caesar is claiming authority over your worldview. He's claiming authority over your thoughts. He's claiming authority over your actions. And if you fail to put the number of the beast, if you fail to put Caesar at the forefront of your mind and guiding your right hand, what happens? Well, what happens is you cannot buy or sell. You are driven out of business. If you do not toe the line of the government, if you do not allow the government to dictate to you what you do, what you think, and what you see, you are driven out of business. You are bankrupted. Does this sound vaguely familiar? So, Jesus' words himself tell us that government is to be limited. It has legitimate authority, but it's only in certain areas, the areas that God gives to it. And all the way through the New Testament, you're seeing different ways that this is hinted at, all the way up to and including Revelation. Because what does Revelation say? If you accept the mark of the beast, you're in a heap of trouble, boy. You know, yeah. And you're in a heap of trouble with the guy it really matters to be in trouble with. Okay, so that's our context. That's how this begins. And all through church history, you see a struggle over where the boundaries between what belongs to the state and what belongs to God are being drawn. All through church history, you see this. Now, the problem is that through a big chunk of church history in Western Europe, the church is claiming authority over everything, including Caesar. But the problem is the Pope and the church and things like that aren't what Jesus was talking about. Okay. Not going to even go there right now. What we get in the Reformation is the beginnings of actually the first time we're really seeing a coherent, thought-through movement of what happens in response to government overreach. You know, through the Middle Ages, particularly in the 14th century, you get various groups that come up that are kind of revolutionary and things like that. Not very often, but it does happen. But they don't really have kind of a coherent, well-thought-out biblical foundation for what they're doing. That starts emerging during the Reformation. Now, what happens is Luther starts his church reform sort of by accident. He didn't really intend to split the church, but it happens. And then a whole bunch of the Lutheran princes get together. Well, a number of the princes in the Holy Roman Empire convert to Lutheranism. Now, I should note the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. Voltaire, a French philosopher from the Enlightenment, commented that the Holy Roman Empire was a triple misnomer. It wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't an empire. Okay. What it really was a confederation of different states. And they all, well, a number of them, the 7 most important of them, would elect the Holy Roman Emperor. Okay. So you got this confederation of all these different states, and a bunch of them convert to Lutheranism. Now, whether these are always serious religious conversions or whether it's just an attempt not to have to send any of your money to Rome or something like that, that's up for grabs. Okay, but the point is they convert and they don't want to be pushed back into Catholicism. The Holy Roman Emperor, a guy by the name of Charles V, Charles was a progressive-minded Catholic, but he was a staunch Catholic. And nobody in this period, no ruler really believed you could have a religiously divided territory. You know, kingdoms couldn't be religiously divided, or they'd either invite the wrath of God or they'd move into civil war and they'd kill each other over religion. This was just sort of the assumption. It becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy in a lot of cases. But in any event, the Lutheran princes get together and they say, you know, we really need to work together because if we don't, Charles is going to come over and pick us off one at a time. Okay. It's a lot like what Ben Franklin said during the Revolution. If we don't hang together, we will most assuredly hang separately. Okay. So that's the situation. And so they get together in a little town called Schmalkalden, and they come up with a treaty in which it's essentially a mutual defense pact. If the emperor attacks any one of them, the rest of them will join together in defense. Now, the fact of the matter is, this is coming up around 1530, the emperor is in no position to actually act. He protests, he objects to Protestantism and things like that, but he's got his hands full. He's in a war with the Turks. He's in a war with France. The good Catholic emperor is in a war with the Pope. Yeah, that's really important for Henry VIII, but that's another story. So in any event, the princes put this group together called the Schmalkaldic League, and they come to Luther and they say, Luther, look what we've done. We've got this defensive league in to protect your reform. And so we need you to give it your blessing. And Martin says, absolutely not. And so they're like, what? He said, I can't do that. Romans 13. Sound familiar? Romans 13, we can't do this. We have to obey the governing powers. Now, what that means is if the governing powers tell you to do something that God forbids, or forbid you to do something God commands, then you have to engage in passive resistance. You disobey the law and accept the consequences. And the princes are thinking, this is a non-starter. We got to figure out how to convince Luther that he's wrong. And so what they did, they sent in the lawyers. Okay? And the lawyers come to Luther and they say to him, Martin, Romans 13 is certainly really important. It's part of Holy Scripture. We understand that. But you're forgetting a couple of things. First of all, the governing authorities include the princes. They include these lesser people in the government. They're part of the governing authorities that we're called to obey. This is the beginning of something known as the doctrine of the lesser magistrate or the inferior magistrate. Further, the emperor is elected by the princes. And since the princes elect them, in a sense, the princes have authority over the emperor. If they can make emperors, they can remove them. And in fact, now we're not talking about removing the emperor, notice, but it's the prince's duty, since they're the ones who put him in power, it's the prince's duty to oversee the emperor and make sure he doesn't do anything illegal. And if he does, it is their responsibility, not just their right, but their responsibility to resist him. And so let's add on top of that what the implicit argument here is that there is a constitution, an unwritten but de facto constitution, in place in the Holy Roman Emperor that stands over the emperor. The emperor himself is bound by the constitution of the empire. That is the supreme governing authority. They don't put it that way, but that's sort of implicit in their argument. So Luther says, all right, you convinced me. And he signs off on the Schmalkaldic League. And he says basically in something called the Torgau Memorandum, which is dated either 1530 or 1531, depending on what dating system you want to use. That's another story. He says in this that given what the lawyers told him, assuming that that is true, then when the emperor breaks his word or breaks the law, it is the responsibility of the lesser magistrates to, in fact, resist this step toward tyranny. Okay. Now, he wrote this specifically in the context of the Holy Roman Empire, but it pretty quickly spread to a lot of other Protestant areas, and very recently you will see a revival in discussions of this idea of the doctrine of the lesser magistrate, that people lower down in government have a right to resist, actually a responsibility, to resist encroachments on people's rights by higher authorities. So we see this in movements toward nullification in America. Governors who refuse to implement mandates coming from the federal level. Sheriffs who refuse to implement mandates coming from the governor. Those kinds of things. Okay? That's really rooted in this idea of the lesser magistrate that comes up in the Schmalkaldic League. Now, it turns out that things don't stop with the lesser magistrate. Calvin, moving in a bit of a different direction for the moment, Calvin, as he is analyzing Scripture, studying Scripture, and working out his understanding of political theology, he went to the book of Exodus. And in the book of Exodus, what you see is that God sets himself up as king over Israel at Sinai. Okay. And he does this, well, first of all, what he does is he lays out terms. These are the things that you do. These are the things I will do for you. And by the way, if you violate the terms of the covenant, this is what's going to happen. Do you agree? People of Israel said yes. God said, okay, let's go over this again. These are the terms of the covenant. Do you agree? Yes. One more time. These are the terms of the covenant. Do you agree? Yes, we do. Okay, we're good. Okay. God asks Israel 3 times, do you agree to the terms of this covenant? Only after Israel agreed 3 times was the covenant ratified. Calvin's conclusion, number 1, all legitimate government depends on the consent of the governed. Second, if God sets up his government over others, God, who has supreme authority over everything, if he establishes a government via covenant, that's probably how governments ought to be established, right? Okay, so all governments are in essence or should be covenantal structures. Now, this idea gets secularized and it turns into what is known as Calvinist contract theory. Although properly, in Calvin's day especially, you want to talk about it as covenant theory. And this principle of covenant passes into Calvinist thought. You will find this in a lot of different places. Simple example, in America, the Mayflower Compact. Compact is another word for a covenant. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, the first written constitution arguably in world history, set up as a covenant. So this idea of covenantal theory embeds itself into Calvinist thought. Now it may seem a little bit removed from resistance, but we'll get there. We'll get back to that. Now, one of the places where Calvinism spreads is into France. And, you know, the history of French Protestantism, this is what I did my doctorate in. It's really interesting stuff. When you're dealing with like the 1520s or 1530s, a secular historian, one of the most important secular historians of France during this period, a guy by the name of Lucien Febvre, describes the period, and I quote, as a period of magnificent religious anarchy. In the 1540s, though, Catholicism is the official religion, okay? And the people of France are, for the most part, very given to Catholicism, but it's Catholicism of a very, well, frankly, superstitious type. What you're getting is, I don't know if you guys get this rag out here, but what you're getting is weekly world news Catholicism, okay? Their obsession with signs and portents and wonders, and a 2-headed calf is born here, which is a sign that Antichrist is coming, literally. You know, things like that. And Antichrist, by the way, are the Lutherans. So they're, you know, a lot of the population of France are really very anti-Protestant because they see this as literally the armies of Antichrist. Now, 1540s, things begin to change. Now, you still got a lot of this other religious ferment going on, remember? Religious anarchy. 1540s, it begins to change. Because in the 1540s, a Frenchman by the name of John Calvin begins writing theological treatises in the French language. And Calvin was brilliant. I mean, whether you like him or not, and personally, I'm not sure I'd really want to have a beer with him, but he is, without doubt, he actually preferred white wine. Actually, when Calvin was negotiating his salary with Geneva, he actually included in his salary negotiations about 500 liters of wine annually. This is a unit in the period that was known as a butt. So Calvin actually asked for a buttload of wine as part of his salary. But anyway, where was I? Because of these high-quality theological because of these theological treatises, a lot of the French Protestants, this sort of amorphous Protestant movement begins converting toward Calvinism. And further, a number of members of the nobility also begin converting to Protestantism. Now, a lot of the reason for this is probably because French Catholicism was so given over to superstition, signs and portents and all that kind of thing. And what Calvinism did, well, whatever else you may say about it, it is a highly rational system. And what it did is it offered escape from the kind of prophetic angst that seized most people in France. And so the educated elites, the nobility, people like this begin converting to Calvinism from Catholicism. And this is a problem because the nobility, the monarchy, starting in the 1530s because of a boneheaded propaganda move by the Protestants in that period, starting in the 1530s, the monarchy began a period of somewhat sporadic but fairly systematic persecution of Protestants, especially in the city of Paris. Not to put too fine a point on this, if you were convicted of holding to the Protestant heresy, you would become the guest of honor at a public barbecue. Okay. So, what happens when the monarchy begins converting? The monarchy have their own private armies. And suddenly, this becomes a threat to the monarchy. So the monarchy has to find a way to try to deal with this. And so in January of 1562 or 1563, depending on what dating system you're using, they issue something called the Edict of January. This was done by the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, to try to save the kingdom for her kids. And what the Edict of January said is that Protestant nobles can hold religious services in their private homes, in their townhouses in most cities except Paris, and in certain other situations. This is a way of trying to get hold of this to allow for a degree of religious toleration to keep the kingdom from degenerating into civil war. Now the problem is just a couple months later in March, a group of Catholic noblemen, the Guise family, along with their entourage, was traveling back from Paris to their territory in the Lorraine area, and they passed a little village called Vassy. And in Vassy, in a barn outside the village, was a group of Protestants who were worshiping legally according to the terms of the Edict of January. They knew they were Protestants who were worshiping because they were singing psalms. The thing that the French Protestants did all the time was sing psalms. They sang psalms marching into battle. And actually, there are Catholic generals who comment that when the Huguenots are singing psalms, you can't beat them. Well, Guise surrounded the barn. There were a couple of provocations on either side. They opened fire and slaughtered a bunch of people. And once that happened, the Protestants got wind of it. They mobilized their armies near the city of Orleans. When the Protestants mobilized their armies, the king mobilized his armies, and this began a cycle of wars of religion. The pattern's pretty simple. You have a provocation, frequently caused by the Guise. The sides mobilize, they go into battle, they fight until they're basically exhausted. Then a truce is granted in which the Protestants are allowed either greater or lesser freedom to worship, depending on how well they did on the battlefield. Repeat. Provocation, new war. I mean, this happens over and over again. This is exactly the kind of thing Catherine de' Medici was trying to prevent. So what she did is they decided to have to try to solve the problem. They did what you always do in diplomacy in this period. They decided to arrange a diplomatic marriage. Okay, so Yeah, you know, there's a meme floating around on Facebook that says, my daughter told me she wanted to be treated like a princess, so I married her off to someone she didn't know to strengthen my treaty with Prussia. So the idea here is you bring in at least the highest ranking, the titular head of the Protestant side, who happened to be a guy by the name of Henry of Navarre, who's King of Navarre, a close relative, actually, of the royal family. And she married her to her daughter, Marguerite. And the idea is this would bring the two sides together. They're all one happy family now. Well, one family now. And this will solve the problem. The problem was, however, that, so they offer the safe conduct. They allow Protestants to come into Paris for the wedding. And everything's supposed to be fine, except for the Guise family, who really didn't like a prominent member on the Protestant side, the Admiral of France, a guy by the name of Coligny, and he tried to assassinate them during the ceasefire. The Protestants, well, he got badly wounded but wasn't killed. The Protestants got really understandably upset with this. The royal family panicked. They have all these Protestants in town. They're afraid that the Protestants are going to march on the palace and kill the royal family in revenge. So they give out word, okay, Guise, go finish off Coligny. Just kill Coligny. We'll announce that he was involved in a conspiracy against the throne, which he wasn't, we'll lie. We'll announce that he was involved in a conspiracy against the throne. He's dead, no other problems. Well, something went wrong, something got miscommunicated. They did, in fact, kill Guise, they did, in fact, kill Coligny, but it actually triggered a general massacre of the Protestants in the city. Thousands of Protestants were butchered in the streets of Paris. Their bodies were thrown in the Seine River, which the accounts say literally turned red with their blood. They were washed up on an island near where there's a miniature reproduction of the Statue of Liberty in Paris. There's an island there called the Allée des Cygnes, or Swan Alley, where the bodies ended up washing up. Word spread around France that a massacre of the Protestants had occurred. And copycat massacres occurred across the kingdom with upwards of 20,000 people killed. When the Pope heard about it, he ordered a celebratory hymn sung. Now, this created a problem for the surviving Huguenots. A lot of them converted back to Catholicism. They said, there's no way God can be on our side. The ones that were left, you've actually managed to kill off the older, more experienced, more temperate leadership. You're left in the hands of the younger hotheads, frankly. And they end up they're faced with a bad situation. They'd always argued, we're loyal to the crown. The problem is the king's evil advisors. Now, Charles IX actually issued a statement. He didn't really want the massacre to take place, but he issued a statement where he said the killing of Coligny was necessary to preserve the kingdom because he was conspiring against the crown. All the conspirators are now dead, and then some. And everything's over. The Huguenots can return to their homes. Everything will be safe and all of that kind of thing. It's a nice statement. Again, lying. I've got a personal attachment to that particular statement. I was in a library, actually the Library of the Society of the History of French Protestantism in Paris, while I was doing my research, and there's this folio of 16th century papers. And I flip it over. I'm going through them one after another, trying to figure out if any of them are things that I need. And I got the original of that decree in my hand, Charles IX's signature on it. Now, I've been handling 16th century documents. This is just sort of a part of my job at this point. But that one was really cool. I mean, this was one of these things I'd studied, and here it is. I've got it in my hand. Well, anyway, the problem is, the Huguenots weren't buying it. But they're in a bad situation. We want to be loyal to the crown. We want to obey Romans 13. But now the king is admitting that all of this massacre was done on his orders. This raises the question immediately, when does a legitimate king turn into an illegitimate tyrant? One possible answer is when, after giving a safe conduct to his own people, he kills 20,000 of them. And so you begin getting a series of writers that are talking about that specific question. When is it legitimate to resist a king? When does a king turn into a tyrant? And some of these get as far as actually advocating regicide, killing the king. For our purposes, though, at the moment, there's a lot of different theories. I'm not going to go through those here. There's one in particular, though, that's worth noting because it was translated into English, and it actually had a big influence in England in thinking about this during both the Puritan Revolution and the Glorious Revolution later. And it was one of John Adams' favorite political treatises over here. It had an influence here. It's known by its Latin title, Vindiciae contra Tyrannos, which translates to a vindication of liberty against tyrants. And there's actually one of the early public domain translations of this has been published by Canon Press with an introduction by me. And but the Vindiciae has some really interesting arguments that it makes with respect to bringing together covenant ideas of government and resistance theory. What it says is that governments in human situations really, there are two different covenants that are involved. One is between God and the nation, as it were, God and the king and people. The other is a second covenant between the king and the people. The second covenant is in some ways governed by the first covenant. The second covenant cannot violate the terms of the first covenant. But there are these two covenants in place. And if the king violates either covenant, resistance to him is not just a right, it is a duty. And then there are a number of other areas where it goes, but it all revolves around this area. What happens when the king usurps authority that isn't his, violates terms of covenant, those kinds of things. However, it is still arguing in favor of resistance by the lesser magistrate. When the king violates the terms of the covenant, the lesser magistrates need to stand up and resist him. That could involve bringing the people in if necessary. You're going to need troops, okay? But it has to be led by the lesser magistrate. The lesser magistrate doctrine, however, gets undermined, actually gets changed substantially in Britain. And in both Scotland and England, what you see is a number of reformers, Protestant, actually Calvinists, are going to look at this idea of resistance theory and this idea of covenant, and they're going to say, wait a minute. If the covenant is between the king and the people, and the king violates the terms of the covenant, the people are the ones who need to resist. It's not, the covenant isn't between the king and the lesser magistrate. The covenant is between the king and the people. And so when the king violates the terms of the covenant, the people have the right, and if you accept the argument of the Vindiciae, they have the responsibility to resist. That was an incredibly important and frankly fateful change, because that is what's going to be behind the Puritan Revolution in England. It's going to be behind the Glorious Revolution in England, and it's fundamental to the American Revolution. Okay. I'm going to just go to one other person here to bring it to the American Revolution so you can see what's going on. Then I'll give you a couple of wrap-up words and we'll go to Q&A. John Locke. Locke was the guy who really came up with the political theory to defend the Glorious Revolution. And in this theory, what he did is he took resistance theory, particularly the British kind, resistance by the people, combined it with covenant theory, which he kind of secularized to the term contract. And on top of that, he added one other dimension. And this is an idea that comes to us really through medieval political thought. That's the idea of unalienable rights. The definition of an unalienable right is a right that cannot be arbitrarily taken from you. all the way up to the point where it's a right you do not have the right to relinquish. Okay? So this is why, well, where do the unalienable rights come from? This isn't how Locke does it. But the easiest way to understand this is to look at Genesis 1 and 2. What are the things that God gave to people before human government? Well, one of them is life, which means that since God gave us life, God is the one who's responsible for it and who has authority over it, which means that you cannot arbitrarily be deprived of your life, even by yourself. You do not have authority over your own life. That's in God's hands. But nobody else has authority over your life either. Second, this is a little more obscure, liberty. I have to understand what the word liberty means. When I was a kid, they told me that liberty was an old-fashioned word for freedom. That's sort of right, but it's more wrong than right, okay? Because we don't understand freedom correctly. What liberty is, classical understanding, this actually goes back to the Romans. This is before, pre-Christian understanding of this. What the word referred to is your ability to make choices and to act freely within the boundaries set by divine and natural law and maybe by the law of the state. Liberty always has boundaries. The boundaries, at the most fundamental level, the boundaries set by divine and natural law, which according to Christian political theory also should guide the law of the state. Laws that do not conform to divine or natural law are not legitimate laws at all. Read, in fact, a guy you may have heard of by the name of Martin Luther King, a letter from the Birmingham jail. He lays this out. Now, so that's what liberty is. It's the right to act within boundaries. The problem that we have is that we think of freedom in terms of what in the 18th century was called license, which, by the way, is the root word for our word licentious. Okay? License is the freedom to act without regard to boundaries. No one can tell me what to do. I am radically free. There are no boundaries that you can set. I can do anything I can manage to pull off. And I can try things that I can't pull off. There's nothing there are no boundaries that are set for us. No one in political thought that I have found up until maybe the anarchists in the 19th century ever argued that we have a natural right to license. We have a natural right to liberty. And that, in fact, is founded in the Garden of Eden, where Adam, you can eat the fruit of any tree in the garden except that one. The except that one is the boundary condition that allows liberty to exist. Without that exception, we are left with license, not liberty. So liberty is, as understood classically, that term liberty, that's found in the garden. God gives that right to Adam and Eve. The last one that's worth noting is property. I'm picking these three because these are the three Locke works with. Now, the history of the development of property rights is rather complicated, and I'm not going to go through it. The irony, of course, is that the idea that the right to property is an unalienable right was actually developed by Franciscan theologians who used it to defend their idea of poverty. But Locke has a different way of getting at property rights. He's getting these ideas of life, liberty, and property from medieval theologians. He's not originating these things. He's getting them from medieval theologians. But he's got a different way of defining property rights or explaining where they come from. What Locke said we have is what's known as the labor theory of property. And what that says is that when you work to produce something, you put some of yourself into it. And since you essentially own yourself, by putting some of yourself into the production, you own the thing that you produced. You have a right to it. Now there are limitations on this. It's, you You can't have a monopoly. You have to do this in such a way that other people have the same opportunity you do. Okay, so there are some restrictions that he puts on it. Well, where do we see this in Genesis? Adam, tend to the garden, eat the fruit. In other words, Adam, you go to work, you tend the garden, you get the production going, and you're entitled to the fruit of your labor, literally. Okay, so these ideas of life, liberty, and property, even though Locke doesn't explicitly, I think Locke knew they were in Genesis. He doesn't actually make the argument from Genesis. He does it using other means. But these things are founded very deeply in biblical thinking and in long thinking on rights within the Christian tradition. Now, from there, so Locke's argument then, to put it together, he says people have these unalienable rights that are given to them by God. They can make a contract with the government so that the government agrees to protect these rights. That's the government's job, is to protect these unalienable rights. And there are other, the specific conditions of the government will vary quite a bit, what the exact responsibilities are. But fundamentally, the government is there to protect these rights. If the government violates these rights, then it has broken its side of the contract, which means that the contract can be considered null and void, and the people can overthrow the government and replace it with another one that is more likely to suit their needs. If you want the shortest summary of this, read the prologue to the Declaration of Independence, because Jefferson is essentially summarizing Locke. Make sure you get it punctuated right. That's important because most modern editions of the Declaration of Independence are punctuated incorrectly. There was a publisher who put a period where there should have been a comma once, and it actually changes the meaning a bit. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, comma, not period. And when you read it with the comma, you will see that the entire thrust is a summary of Locke. Okay, so the pursuit of happiness, though, one quick note on that. This isn't the same as property, obviously. So what's going on there? Jefferson is really well-read. He's very familiar with a rather bright guy by the name of Aristotle, who wrote a thing called the Nicomachean Ethics, in which Aristotle argued that the purpose of human life, the reason why we are here, the goal that we are made for, is to achieve, the Greek word is eudaimonia. Eudaimonia refers to a well-lived life, a life that is fully satisfying, a good life in every sense of the word, a life of virtue, a life of excellence, all of these things sort of wrapped up. That word eudaimonia was translated in the 18th century as happiness. So what Jefferson is saying is that you have the right to pursue the purpose of your creation, which is to achieve this kind of life well lived, this kind of virtuous life of excellence, a fully satisfying life, all of that. You have the government cannot take away from you the very purpose of your creation. Now, interestingly enough, Jefferson also believed that in order to do that, you had to have property rights. So he sort of snuck it in the back door. And Jefferson in particular believed in productive households, to use a term that Chris Wiley uses a great deal. He believed in the yeoman farmer, the farmer who owns his land and works it, because he believed that that was most conducive to producing a virtuous life, which was necessary to achieve eudaimonia. Jefferson had very little good to say about people in cities. He referred to them as the swinish masses, and actually doubted that they'd ever be able to govern themselves. Because, saying that near Seattle is actually kind of... But the reason is because they don't have property and they don't learn the kind of responsibility and discipline and hard work and all of those kinds of things that you have to make a successful go with a farm. Here, here. Okay, so That brings us to the Declaration of Independence. Without going into it, the Constitution also pulls in a boatload of things coming out of Christian political theology, especially the doctrine of original sin. You ever wonder about that? Doctrine of original sin? Why do we have checks and balances in the government? It's because nobody can be trusted with absolute power. It really comes out of an Augustinian political tradition, which is a whole another line in the book. But I would argue that the US Constitution and the founding documents are ultimately the final expression of a long tradition of Christian political theology and political thought. We're already beginning to see some secular elements creeping into it, certainly. But the tradition is ultimately ended, I would say prematurely, by the French Revolution. The French Revolution comes along. It's a purely secular revolution. It is a revolution that wants to get rid of everything from the past, especially Christianity. And it's a revolution based on the idea that we're smart enough to figure out a system that will work perfectly, that will bring liberty, equality, and brotherhood, that'll do all of these things. We'll be able to create a utopia because human beings, after all, aren't really fallen. They're perfectible. And if we get the right state in place, and we're the ones who are smart enough to know how to do it, if we get the right state in place, it'll happen. And the result was hundreds, actually well over 100,000 people killed during the French Revolution, either at the guillotine or in the people who opposed the revolution, counter-revolutionary forces in France, are slaughtered en masse by the government. Troops that surrender, slaughtered. Peasants in the area that are revolting, slaughtered. It's, this is what happens when you have a purely secular ideology governing your politics. This is what happens when you try to create a utopia, because every utopian is a totalitarian. And in order for the promised land to come, in order for the utopia to arrive, the people who oppose it have to be eliminated, because if they are there and opposing it, they threaten the entire coming kingdom. Every time. So this brings us, I have no idea how I'm doing for time.
Keep going, keep going.
I'm trying to operate with liberty, not license. All right, so this brings us obviously to current situations. Now, understand when we talk about resistance theory, historically, resistance in this context meant taking up arms. I am not, in case you're listening, I am not advocating that. Okay. But we really need to take a good long look at our situation. And where we begin, I would argue, is with Jesus. What is it that belongs rightfully to the state and what belongs rightfully to God? That's the first question we need to be asking. I would suggest, for example, your mileage may vary, I would suggest, for example, that your bodily autonomy about what things you allow to be injected into you is an issue of personal liberty. Now, you may decide, I have to say, you may decide that the right thing to do is to get vaccinated against COVID. And that's perfectly fine. But it ought to be your decision. So the question is, what happens when that decision is taken out of your hands? What is the right response? How do we do that? What do you do about not just government mandates and stuff, but you'll notice, I hope, that the government is working in the government knows that it's on thin ground legally to put these mandates in place. So what do? They enlist corporations to do their dirty work for them. What the government cannot mandate, a corporation can for its employees. So what do we do? Oh, by the way, do you know what the technical term for a system of political economy that has government in alliance with business, with the government as sort of the senior partner working with business? That's called fascism. That is the technical term. So then we have to add one other thing on top of that. We've got to actually look at China right now and look at the kind of surveillance state that they've put into place. China is at the forefront. They're way ahead of us in terms of artificial intelligence. And the reason why they're at the forefront of artificial intelligence, in part, is because they are very much concerned with creating a total surveillance state so that they know everything everybody is doing at any time. They also completely control all communications media, to the point where American corporations remove things from their app store and things like that and shut them down to keep the Chinese government happy because it's the biggest market in the world. So American corporations are busy participating in the censorship of the Bible and the Coram and things like that in China right now. But they're also heavily involved in censoring us. Try posting something that questions the effectiveness or actually talks about the documented harm that can be caused by COVID vaccines. Try posting it on Facebook, see how long it lasts. Now, I don't want to get too far into the vaccine thing because I'm a historian, I'm not a medical person. But what I've got to tell you is that whenever I'm not allowed to talk about something, whenever one point of view is silenced, it always makes me skeptical of the other. So we're dealing with a rather odd situation. You know, the idea of Leviathan, the idea is, and this has to do with a misunderstanding of the Hebrew word Leviathan, but the idea is, you know, in Thomas Hobbes' book, the state is like a single organism. All of the different people in it make up the different, you know, the different parts of the body, but the king is the head. And so the king makes all the decisions for the body, up to and including religion, which is why I called the book Slaying Leviathan, because essentially the entire Christian political tradition is opposed to that. It's opposed to the idea that Caesar is Lord. It's opposed to this idea, this totalitarian vision of the state. I would argue that with the regulatory state we are facing now, we are seeing a reborn Leviathan. I actually have the statistics in the book of the number of pages that were in the regulations put out by the federal government, and it is staggering. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but they're toward the back of the book in there. Whenever you have, there was a book that came out, I think it was in the 70s, called 3 Felonies a Day. And what this said was that the regulations that are in place right now in the country are so voluminous and so contradictory and so impossible for anybody to comprehend that just going through your daily life, you likely commit approximately 3 felonies a day. What that means is that if you want to, anybody can be arrested at any point for violating laws or regulations in the book. This is where you get problems like selective prosecution. Those of you who aren't paying attention to No Quarter November, you might want to listen to November 1st. We are facing, so what we've got is this combination of this vast government bureaucracy, a regulatory state that, Congress passes laws, but Congress doesn't write the rules you live by. That's handed off, the Congress passes general blueprints, and that's then handed off to unelected bureaucrats who work out all the details. And that's what produces this voluminous regulatory state. So we're dealing with that. We are also dealing with censorship. We're dealing with cancel culture. And all of these things are working kind of hand in glove with each other to push the country in a particular direction that I strongly suspect the vast majority of people don't want it to go in. Now, most people are content to sit back and say, gee, this is really too bad, this really shouldn't be happening, and just let it happen to them. The question is, what should we be doing as Christians? Now, I would suggest, first of all, like I said, I want to be very clear that I think active resistance of the sort that resistance theory historically has implied is a serious mistake. I'm not in any way advocating that. But we have lots of different options that we can work with. We can write letters to the paper or to congressmen, senators, the president. We can lobby. We can run for office. We can promote people in office. We can work to unseat incumbents. There are all kinds of things that are readily available to us as ways of responding, as ways of, if you will, resisting in our current context. Beyond that, we can move to things like protests. It is possible, actually, according to the Constitution, we have the right to peaceable assembly and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So protests are perfectly legitimate. And if you do them right, you can even do them without violating any laws. It won't necessarily stop you from getting arrested, but you can. For those of you who aren't paying attention to Moscow, go back and read. We can protest. If these things fail, we can move to civil disobedience. There's a progression here, step by step by step. When we're talking about resistance, we're not talking immediately about any kind of violent resistance. One quick note on violent resistance. Let me just point out something that seems to be overlooked by both sides. The Second Amendment people talk about how the right to bear arms was actually intended to be a threat to government, to avoid government overreach. The anti-Second Amendment people will say, oh yeah, right, like you're going to be able to stop an Abrams tank, an F-14, whatever. Yeah. That's the answer. That is the answer. The fact of the matter is, it can be done. 2 words, Iraq, Afghanistan. However, what were the consequences? One of the things about just war theory, if you look back in just war theory, there are a number of criteria that have to be met before a war can be considered a just war. One of them, by the way, is it has to be declared by a legitimate authority. Okay. But along with this, you have the likelihood of success, and you have proportionality. The damage done by the war has to be proportionate to the offense. It cannot cause more damage than the war itself can cause. If it did, this is one of the things people never really think about. The Taliban did, that's right, but what was the price? The price was a failed state. Is that a cost that we are willing to impose on the society? I would suggest it would be a mistake. Okay, so I want to be really clear about that. Even if you think through all of the various options here, the consequences of that kind of thing are really bad. And they're bad for everybody, not just us. Actually, suffering for our faith is something that Jesus promises us. It doesn't really seem to be an option if you read the New Testament carefully. So we need to be aware of this, and this is something that we also have to take into account. So what do we do? Well, I would suggest that in practical terms, there are all the political things you can do. But I would also suggest two other lines that I think are really important. One of them is that we need to get our act together and start living as a Christian community. Rod Dreher wrote a book called The Benedict Option. I think he really made a mistake with the title because it's led people to misunderstand what he's saying. What he's really saying is that if you don't want your children to be indoctrinated by the state, you've got to prepare a community that will pass on our values to the next generation, because values are always formed in community. So what we need to do is to set up intentional communities to preserve and to pass on our values to the next generation. But it goes beyond that. What happens when people in your community lose their jobs because they refuse to do something that violates their conscience? Luther, by the way, was very clear that conscience is something that neither the church nor the state can bind. Your conscience belongs to you and God, no one else. So what happens when people lose their job? What does the church do?
Community up.
That's right. That's the right answer. The church has to be prepared to step up and to support those who lose jobs, who lose livelihood, actually lose family and relationships because they won't violate their conscience. It's worth noting that when you read carefully in the book of Acts, and it talks about they had all things in common, and people will say, yeah, they're primitive communism. No. When Ananias and Sapphira, when that incident occurs, you will notice that Peter says to them, the property was yours, and after you sold it, the money was yours. The problem wasn't that they didn't turn everything over. The problem was that they lied about it. You could have done whatever you wanted to with it. It's not ours. They accepted property rights. It's not communism. When they're saying they had all things in common, they explain it right away. No one had any need among them, because whenever someone had need, someone in the community would sell their property and support them. We need to be thinking about what that looks like for us, because we are going to be finding people in our community who are going to lose their livelihood. And the question is whether we are more committed to holding on to what's ours or supporting our brother in need. There's a cost, but we need to be thinking long and hard about that. Along with this kind of thing, forming up as a community, supporting each other, and all of that sort of thing, we also, I would argue, need to be thinking about developing alternative institutions to the ones that are out there. It looks like I'm hitting on themes that are already familiar. Okay, so we need to be developing alternative institutions. This involves entrepreneurship, businesses, things like that. Let's talk about entrepreneurs for a moment. What do they do? Fundamentally, what an entrepreneur does is he looks out into his community, however you would define that, and he says, what are the needs here that I can meet? And he develops a system for meeting those needs. That's what entrepreneurs do. I would suggest that all of us need to be entrepreneurs, although in different ways. Some of us will be business-oriented entrepreneurs, but we also need to be looking around us at the needs in our community and constantly asking the question, what can I do to help? And along with that, what can we do to help? Because ultimately, you cannot slay Leviathan by yourself. You are not St. George. Okay? You have to, we need to be working together in community, supporting each other, looking for opportunities to express the kingdom of God in our community. In the kingdom of God, everything that is broken is restored. And that's what we need to be doing. We need to be working in that way, but we also need to be banding together and helping each other, encouraging one another to love and good deeds. And we need to be, well, taking care of those in our midst who may otherwise become casualties. Because make no mistake, we're in a war. Scripture's been clear about that from day one. And things, we've had a relatively lull in the fighting in America, but make no mistake, it's heating up. So the important thing is, again, intentional, I can't say this enough, intentional community, supporting each other, willing to sacrifice for each other, but at the same time remembering that Jesus promised that the gates of hell would not prevail against his church. The last time I checked, gates never attacked anybody. A gate is a defensive fortification, and we are not to huddle up defensively. We are the ones that are on the offense, and we need to remember that as well. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Glenn Sunshine. We do have some time for some Q&A, and what it's probably going to... Are you showing me the clock? I'm showing you at 8:30. Oh, yeah. Okay. We have some time for Q&A. 2 hours. We wanted you to keep going. Maybe we'll take a very small number of questions, and then we will end our time with doxology. So any questions right off the bat? Yes?
Back in those discussions about the monarchy, did the divine right of kings thinking figure into anyone's side?
Yeah.
I'm just going to repeat the question for the tape. The question was, back in the monarchy times, did the divine right of kings factor into any of this thinking?
Yeah, the divine right of kings actually shows up in the 17th century, right about the time you're seeing this push toward absolutist government.
Not till then?
Not till then. The divine right of kings is not a medieval idea. Medieval idea always recognized that kings were human and therefore subject to original sin. Divine right of kings is a 17th century effort to push toward absolutist government.
So do you see that manifesting today?
I see a lot of people who look at Romans 13 the way Luther originally did, without really thinking through all the implications in detail of what that actually means in the real world.
All right, other question? Yes.
Thoughts on Jeremiah 29 and being exiles in Babylon and prospering and growing and seeking the peace of the city?
Thoughts on Jeremiah 29:11, growing and seeking the peace of the city?
Yeah, the biblical idea is that we are strangers and aliens in this world. Our final citizenship is in heaven. Well, in the new heavens and new earth. We are looking forward to that day. But in the meantime, we are in this world, and I would say that a lot of what it says in Jeremiah 29 is simple Christian ethics. That we are to be seeking the good of the people around us. We are to be working hard. We are to be settling in. This is where we are placed for now. We are strangers and exiles in this world, but he's placed us in this point. This is our place of exile. So yeah, we need to be following those instructions because it seems to me it's basic Christian ethics that we should be seeking to do good to all people. And, like I said, working hard, settling in, participating in the community life and everything else.
Over there?
More magistrates saying, I think we're seeing evidence that the federal government is buying the lower magistrates for funding. And I'm sure there were parallels, but I wonder if there's a little different battle here when the lower magistrates are in a place where they can't survive without the funding
So is that a question?
Yeah, okay, repeat.
Or maybe not. When lower magistrates are funded by the king, what do you do? Because they're not stopping, apparently.
Yeah, kings have historically always tried to buy off the lesser magistrate. It's always happened. And we're in a situation now where everything all the way up to and including public school systems gets federal funding. I would say this is a dangerous situation to be in, which is why we need alternative institutions.
The facility we used to meet in as a whole church all at once was given funding by Bill Gates, and a stipulation was that they would maintain a vaccine
Mandate.
requirement for people coming into the facility. I don't think we can use it anymore, and other people have had to not use it because of that.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be the government. People with money and power always buy.
Oh, the theater in Bremerton. Okay. I was like, not our church.
But we meet for Easter.
Oh yeah. Okay. Got it. Oh yeah. The Admiral Theater. Sorry. Yes. Yeah. We'll do 2 more questions.
So as a mom of young kids, feels a little bit like just before the stuff went down with the Scottish governors and just before stuff goes down with the Huguenots, can you give us, parents in the trenches with really young kids, some like Huguenot hot tips on how to like raise little joyful resistance to tyranny people?
So the question is, can we get some hot Huguenot tips on how to raise our kids to be hot Huguenot resistors of tyranny? Joyful, submitting to the Lord.
Joyfully resisting tyranny.
I would actually not go to the Huguenots for that. And the reason is, you have no idea, I won't even tell you the stories, you have no idea the level of persecution that was going on in that period. I mean, especially with mothers and children. I mean, it was horrific. I'd go to the Amish. The Amish raise their kids in their community. Now, the Amish are a lot more sophisticated than we give them credit for. They're not these sort of quaint people stuck in the 18th century, okay? They don't want to do anything that will break up the community, that will disrupt the community. That's really their central ideal. They raise the children in the community, and then when they get to be adult, they kick them out. They say, go out, experience what the world has to offer. If you want to come back, you come back and you stay. If you want to stay out there, just stay out there. That's fine. Whatever you choose. They almost always come back. And the reason is that done right, a community, a close community with mutual support is going to always win out over the rabid individualism in the world. So what you need to do, you don't do this by yourself. You do it in community. And you have the community around you. You raise your kids in that context. Remember, values are formed in community. That's really the best thing that you can do.
Another question?
I'll bring you in, actually. So you talked about fighting and how you don't think that's the way to go, which I actually agree with. But I think about Australia and them being disarmed, and I think about what they're going through, and I think about the options Americans have because of our Constitution, and I think about their options. And if, thankfully, we're not in their situation, but like, what would you say the advice would be to someone that's in that situation?
So, given Australia and the extreme conditions there, and what is another, what would you suggest for that kind of situation?
I think that we get to a point where we ask the question, what belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God? We are commanded in Hebrews 12 not to forsake our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but to encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. We are commanded to assemble together. I don't think that includes Zoom. It's really difficult to celebrate communion over Zoom. It's really difficult to baptize children over Zoom. Although I do remember one Anglican priest in Connecticut who, in the period of social distancing, baptized a child with a super soaker. No joke, it really happened. I think that the answer that, remember, there are a lot of things you can do internally politically, but when it gets to a point where you are expressly forbidden from doing something that God commands, that's the point at which you move to civil disobedience. If you're not allowed outside, well, let me put it to you this way. If you get a massive number of people coming out for a protest, they can't arrest everybody. Well, they can, yeah. So at that point, I think really you're at a point where you do all the legal things, but you might have to get to the point where it moves towards civil disobedience.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your questions. I have one thing I'm going to add, one more question for you. And it's not really a question, it's something I just want you to talk about because I love it whenever you talk about it. You often emphasize prayer.
Mm-hmm.
And I would love for you just to talk about prayer as it relates to this situation, this kind of stuff.
Okay, yeah. First of all, let's go to, since we've been doing warfare, and by the way, my tie here is from the Bayeux Tapestry. It shows the Norman conquest of England. There's a reason I wore it. But when we talk about this, we think about spiritual warfare, and that should take us right to Ephesians 6, the armor of God. Now, the problem with the armor of God is that people always stop too soon. They use all of the different points of the imagery of armor, but then they miss the fact that right after he discusses all of the points on the image, he says, and pray, 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 pray. Yeah. Pray with all petition and all supplication with, it just... So yeah, you put on the armor of God, but the thing that really makes it all work is prayer. I haven't been able to track this down, but I've read that there's a Barna survey that says that the average American prays somewhere between 2 and 6 minutes per day. Average American Christian. And that includes grace at meals. That, to me, demonstrates conclusively that we don't believe in prayer. Because if we did, we'd do it more. Okay. Prayer, the degree of emphasis on prayer in Scripture is pretty stunning. The problem that we face is, well, first of all, I would argue that we've got an anti-supernatural worldview. We don't really believe that things that aren't in the physical world affect things in the physical world. Okay. Weird thing to say for Christians, but I think it's true. But the other problem we face is a practical one. According to psychologists who study these things, the average American, as of the last time I saw it, had an attention span of 8.2 seconds. Now, what's really, it was 8.3 seconds. What's really interesting about this is that the same psychologists will tell you that a goldfish has an attention span of 9.2 seconds. This is literally true. We're sort of like squirrel. We're distracted so incredibly easily because, well, actually, the internet is one of the things that really hurts us on this one. So let's just move this to sort of a practical issue. How do you learn to pray when you've got an attention span a second shorter than a goldfish? How do you do this? My future son-in-law is a pastor in Sierra Leone. And the head of, they pray like you would not believe. And the head of their ministry is a guy named Shadonka Johnson. Shadonka is one of the great unknown saints of the 21st century. I mean, he is, yeah, I could talk about him all night. I asked Shadonka, I said, given how short our attention span is, how do you learn to pray? How do you teach people to pray? So I'll give you Shadanka's advice here. He says, you guys, unlike in our country, you guys know how to read. Use the Psalms. You use the fact that you can read to help you focus your attention. And when you pray the Psalms, when you use the Psalms for prayer, don't just recite the Psalm. Unpack it. Lord, your word tells us that you are our shepherd. And like a shepherd, you lead us, you guide us, you take care of us, you feed us, you provide for us, and you protect us. That's who you are, and that's who you are for us. And I want to thank you and praise you that that is who you are. And that I am one of your sheep, and that you are there to guide me and take care of me. And because of that, I know I shall never be in want. Everything that I need is provided by you. You don't fail in any way. You take care of us completely. And so on. You can do it with the Psalms. I would suggest looking at Paul's prayers. I especially like his prayer in chapter 1 of Colossians. But there's a great one in Ephesians 1, Ephesians 3, Philippians 1. These are all prayers that we can use and work through and just unpack them, pray through them phrase by phrase. What does this mean? How do I put this in? What is it saying to me? How am I being encouraged by this? I thank you for that. Lord, you promised these things here. I carry through. That is, above all else, the thing, and I didn't get to this, and I'm glad you brought it up. Above all else, the thing that the church needs now is people who are serious about prayer. Amen. That's fundamental to everything. So.
Amen. Well, let's give a round of applause for Dr. Sunshine.